Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this talk discussing food systems, climate, and the investor voice as part of the third virtual London Climate Action Week. My name is Teni Ikundere. I'm the head of investor outreach for the FAIRR initiative, a free-to-join global investor network with $38 trillion of assets under management and investor support. And we focus on the risks and opportunities in the food system with a particular focus and emphasis on the global protein supply chains. Now, first of all, I want to congratulate the organizers of London Climate Action Week with almost 250 events this week, ranging from discussions on law and technology through to the circular economy and the impact of art on addressing the climate crisis. And so this shows how really all of society is being galvanized to mitigate the climate emergency. And certainly there is the need for action. The fast and increasingly intense heat waves that we're experiencing globally certainly shows that. And currently we're seeing the news out of California and Canada, the lives that are being put at risk, the crops that's being threatened. So certainly there is the need to galvanize action on this front. When it comes to FAIRR, as I said, we do focus on the animal and the protein supply chains. We have members from asset owners to asset managers. We range all around the globe, and it is really a network of institutional investors who are really focused on working together to mitigate these impacts and these issues that we face. We provide a range of tools when it comes to helping investors navigate this space. We look at how we can help investors with understanding and defining the material risks, how it helps them when it comes to figuring out how to quantify some of these risks and build this into the investment making decisions, how we can engage with policymakers to ensure that the investor perspective is being heard and that they are being part of the solution that we are all working towards, as well as ensuring that we are engaging with these companies to drive impact and to help them to understand what more can be done in order to mitigate the ESG risks, not just in climate, but also, for example, antimicrobial resistance, which also feeds in to further issues and risks that we face globally. Now, we provide a range of member tools online which members are able to sign on to access, which helps them and supports them in that. This year, certainly, we feel it is really a pivotal year when it comes to policy and regulation. There's a real opportunity for global governments, we feel, as ministers come together to build back better from the pandemic and put us on the path to a more resilient future. Now, governments will be speaking about climate and biodiversity through this year, whether at COP26 or COP15 in China in October. There will be finance minister meetings and at the UN Food System Summit. So really this year, there's a convergence of dialogues on food, and it's real opportunity for us to transform this food system. And so this year, we've started a new policy work stream to support our members as they navigate this. We help them when it comes to understanding the regulatory landscape that they face, when it comes, as I mentioned, to helping ensure that their voice is being heard amongst policymakers and that they are feeding in when it comes to those ESG issues related to intensive animal agriculture, and that we're encouraging the scaling up of sustainable protein production as well. So this year, we've had quite a few projects that we've already been working on. The Investor Action on AMR, which is a global coalition specifically focused on addressing antimicrobial resistance and supporting and working in the policy sphere on that, as well as working with the Good Food Finance Initiative, supporting the development of a toolbox to help to scale up sustainable finance in food systems, including through the use of blended finance, working on investor subsidy working group, which is calling on a statement, which builds really on a statement which we began in March, which we put forward in March, calling for reform on common agricultural policies in order to align with climate goals. And more specifically, more recently, I should say, is investor statement, Where's the Beef? Now, this is supported by the former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, which we're delighted by, and already has $5 trillion of investor support. My colleague Helena is going to talk a little bit more about this and the need for this state, or how we came about this statement, and the need to really ensure that agriculture is being addressed when it comes to government's national determined contributions as they have been releasing these commitments going into the run-up of at COP26. So I'll pass over to my colleague Helena, who we're delighted to have as our policy director at FAIRR, who'll be leading a really interesting panel that I'm really looking forward to hearing from. Helena, over to you.
Thanks very much, Teni, and great to be here today. As Tony just mentioned, we launched an investor statement related to this topic, supported by 5 trillion of investors, basically calling on the G20 policymakers to have better disclosure in terms of the reduction targets in agriculture that we will see under their nationally determined contributions. And just while we go over to the panel, I wanted to briefly introduce each of our high-level panelists for this discussion today. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Lisa Bovenat-Lane, the Head of Sustainability and ESG and Executive Director of Impacts Asset Management. Lisa's responsible for the development and oversight of impacts, sustainability and ESG analysis. Next, I'd like to introduce Eugenie Matthew, the Senior SRI Analyst at Aviva Investors. Eugenie is the Senior Analyst on the Aviva Stewardship Funds. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to introduce Bob Ward, the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE. So I'd just like to briefly give each panelist an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we will go into the Q&A session. And while the Q&A is going on, I'd like you all to drop questions into the chat box. So please, inviting audience participation here. If you have any questions, please do feel free to drop those. Lisa, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much to FAIRR for inviting me. So my name is Lisa Bovenat. I'm heading the ESG and sustainability research at Impacts, and really with the sort of 3 main areas of focus. Of course, the ESG analysis at the company level and developing all the methodologies around that work. And secondly, seeing what we learn from the ESG analysis in terms of going back to the companies in terms of engagement and stewardship, and overseeing and developing that aspect of our work to really try to get to the best possible outcomes. And thirdly, developing methodologies for as effectively and accurately as possible also measure the impact that our investments are having. So those are my sort of 3 main areas of work. Very glad to be here this morning.
Thanks, Lisa. Eugenie, would you like to briefly introduce yourself as well?
Thanks. Hi, yes, Eugenie Matthew from Aviva Investors. I'm responsible for what we call the Earth Pillar, which is all environmental issues apart from climate change. We have another person responsible for that rather big issue. And I've been working with FAIRR for quite a few years now on their excellent engagement programs on sustainable protein in supermarkets, and also the engaging with fast food companies on their meat and dairy supply chain. So really love all FAIRR's work. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Eugenie. Bob, I don't know if you want to quickly introduce yourself as well, and then we'll kick off the discussion section.
Very good. So I oversee the engagements with policymakers, the public and the media at the Grantham Research Institute, which is a research centre at LSE, and I work very closely with Nicholas Stern, amongst others. You may have seen most recently a report that he led for the G7 that was commissioned by Boris Johnson on the sustainable recovery. So that's an attempt to persuade the G7 to embrace a investment-led recovery that not only accelerates economic growth out of the pandemic, but also the transformation, accelerate the transformation towards sustainable growth in the long term. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. That's really helpful. So I guess just to kick off the discussion, I think I'd like to ask a question to you, Bob, which is around obviously the topic of the NDCs and the lack of disclosure on agricultural reduction targets within those current NDCs as it stands. So the analysis seems to show that the G20 countries have not disclosed what their reduction targets would be in the agricultural sector so far. Why do you think this is the case from your perspective?
Yes, I don't think it's a conspiracy to hide information. I think it reflects a couple of things. The first is that it can be technically quite difficult to measure emissions, particularly from the land use sector. You may be aware that the UK earlier this year did a massive correction in its reporting of its emissions, which showed that the land use sector itself was a net positive contribution to emissions. In other words, it's a net source rather than a net sink of carbon dioxide, of all greenhouse gas emissions. So it can be quite difficult. In most countries, they set targets for emissions at a kind of an economy level rather than setting sub-targets for sectors. And I think in the agriculture and the land use sector, it's particularly challenging because unlike, say, the power sector, where there are technological fixes, you can change people's sources of electricity, relatively straightforward. You're not really asking the consumer to do more than just accept that their electricity is coming from wind instead of, say, coal. But in the land use sector, there are more questions around the behavior of consumers and the ability of consumers to participate. And we'll probably come into those issues shortly. But it therefore makes it quite challenging then to set targets if you're having to rely on major changes in consumers around diet, for instance, and around their willingness to reduce waste. So the good news is the G20, like all countries, I think, acknowledge the importance of the emissions in this sector and explicitly mention the importance of these emissions, even if they're not setting clear targets for emissions in that sector.
Thanks, Bob. I think that's a really helpful overview. I also have a question for Lisa. What do you think from an investor perspective are the key risks for investors if the transition in the food sector is lagging behind compared to other sectors?
Yeah, thanks, Helena. So the way we think about risks and system risk at Impacts is that overall we believe that that there is a transition underway, a transition to a more sustainable economy. And this really means moving away from more depleted business models to more durable ones, and these more durable business models that can grow and thrive without creating significant negative externalities. So we're looking for these durable business models. And what is driving this transition is new technology, changes to consumer preferences, societal aspects, for example, improve transparency and, like the internet, but also policy. And companies or activities that fail to see this or fail to react to the transition, in our view, will find it hard now and in the future. And there's definitely a sort of transition happening in the food sector. Today, we view it is mainly driven by consumer preference changes. We can see it, for example, within the sort of growing trends around plant-based foods, reformulations, for instance, the sort of natural and free from type trends as well. And so at Impacts, we, in our smart food strategy, we are investing across the food and agricultural value chain, but really focusing on solutions and areas of that value chain that are not likely to be disrupted by, again, technology and consumer preference changes and policy. So sort of areas of interest for us would be ingredients companies and, for example, innovative packaging companies reducing food waste or efficient irrigation. We look for sort of the direction of travel for policy, but as mentioned, so far the transition has really quite clearly coming from consumer preferences and consumers sort of voting with their feet and some companies responding to that. I think there's so much more to do within food on the policy front. And I sort of remember quite vividly a German minister saying a few years ago that in Germany, the industry is unrecognizable in terms of energy efficiency, for example, today compared to 30 years ago, whereas agriculture has not really changed in terms of its environmental performance that much over this same period. So lots of room for improvements on the policy front and sort of investor engagement.
Thanks, Lisa. I think that's a really interesting point that, the consumer preferences are driving a lot of transition in the sector, and perhaps the kind of policy shifts are not sort of catching up to what is occurring in terms of the bottom-up groundswell of consumer movement. So just on the point of kind of investor engagement and how that may support the food transition to a more sustainable food system, I have a question for you, Eugenie, which would be, in addressing the impacts of agriculture and climate change, how far do you think investor engagement can actually go in addressing those risks, and where, on the other hand, does policy really need to step in?
We believe investor engagement is absolutely critical, along with consumer pressure and NGO campaigning. They're vital. And what we can do through engagement is to encourage companies to show leadership, to show that change is possible, which makes it then easier for governments to introduce legislation to level the playing field. It also helps when the companies that we're engaging with can show leadership and can themselves call on the government to change the policies. So the pressure is coming from the companies themselves, the leading companies. However, the regulation is really the only way that we can create the rising tide to lift all the boats and not just some of them. And it's very important, regulation, in correcting market failures. And this whole environmental area is one big market failure. And for example, it's free to emit greenhouse gases or to transform woodland and forest to agricultural land. But the role of governments is pretty key, and we've been seeing that with countries like Brazil and Indonesia. If a government's turning a blind eye to deforestation or even profiting from it or encouraging it, there's only so far investors can go with engagement. We saw last week that the environment minister in Brazil resigned. He's facing investigations for disrupting the government investigations into the largest seizure of illegal timber in Brazil, and disrupting an investigation into a criminal organization, and using his position to weaken inspections on timber exports. So in countries like Brazil or Indonesia, the role of investors in engaging is made a lot more challenging if the government's going in a different direction. Aviva Investors really believes in engagement as a way of driving change, and we prefer divestment to be the last resort because we think it's very important to have a voice. But we also have, we're really proud that we have a team now, 6 people working just on market reform and policy on sustainability. So we've set up a sustainable centre for excellence to engage governments and global organisations like the UN to make the whole world's financial system more sustainable, correct these market failures, manage systemic risks, to promote market integrity in the interests of
Hello, Eugenie. Apologies, I'm not sure if anyone else is getting a bit of a delay in the sound here. Can anybody else hear at the moment?
No, I think we've dropped her. She's
okay. Not a problem. I think we'll wait a moment and then return to Eugenie if that's possible. I might just jump to another question actually for Lisa, and I'd like you to all actually drop any questions that you might have in the chat box as well from the audience. It'd be excellent to hear if anybody has any questions about any of the topics that have been discussed so far. But just another question for you, Lisa, around the role of investors and investor statements. Are there any examples you think from other sectors or areas where investor engagement has had a really positive influence, and what do you think we can learn from those lessons?
Yeah, we really think that investor statements are important and definitely have a role to play, and we view it as a sort of a process that can definitely turn into successful outcomes, and also have some really interesting ripple effects on the way. So I think a well-stated, structured, and sort of innovative investor statements can probably, first of all, lead to interesting internally learning within the investment firms, and sort of provide new insights, even for the investor, actually. But then the statements followed by sort of policy advocacy and dialogue is, of course, the main step. And policymakers are looking for guidance. And I think it's important, as with our sort of company engagements, that sort of dialogue is ongoing, and you keep the momentum and keep that sort of commitment and contact. But it's very important to sort of course, be very specific, sector specific, and we talk a lot about pathways at the moment, and I think those are sort of critical things that we would highlight in investor statements as well. but also identifying sort of win-wins and emphasizing best ways of sharing risk and breaking barriers are key. And I think really sort of explaining the way around decisions on allocation of capital that are made by investors is not always clear to policymakers. So that's pretty key as well. I think an example where an investment statement and dialogue has been really successful in the past would be, for example, the low carbon financing group, which was really a collaboration between investors and policymakers in the UK within the offshore wind industry that ultimately sort of found ways of de-risking the sort of sector and enabled that sort of infrastructure build up very successfully of offshore wind in the UK. So definitely some cases of success there.
Thanks, Lisa. That's a really interesting example, and perhaps there are lessons there for the food sector for kind of de-risking investments in some of the most promising technologies for sustainable food systems as well. I think, Eugenie, we just got cut off from the last part of your presentation. I don't know if you want to quickly continue saying a few words that you were just mentioning around the work that you were doing.
I'm sorry, I don't know exactly when it got cut off, and I don't want to bore you all by repeating myself, but just to say that we have the Sustainable Centre for Excellence, which is 6 people working full-time on lobbying governments and international organisations to change policy on sustainability issues. So hopefully we think engaging with both companies and governments will help create change.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, Eugenie, sorry. I just wanted to go back to the question of this year around sort of the climate action around COP26 that we're seeing here. And I don't know if any of you would like to answer this question, but do any of you seen positive signs of change given the role of COP26 this year and UK leadership? Are there any signals that you see in the market of change in the food system? Bob, I don't know if you have any thoughts, perhaps from the UK perspective, on how the UK government is tackling this issue.
Yeah, so the COP process, this international process, is driven by countries, and those who've been to these negotiations know it's a bit of a bubble where a lot of the arguments seem very technical and they're always very difficult. I mean, the UN process is a consensus process among 197 parties. So when people say to me, why isn't more done there? I think, well, it's incredible anything gets done, given that that's what you're trying to do. Consensus between 197 parties is very difficult. I think we're going to see the issues that are being discussed at the moment, and the critical ones, are around aspects of the so-called Paris rule book. There's still no agreement on the setting up of these international carbon markets and offsetting rules, which is left over from the last few years. But the issue that is going to potentially threatens it is the arguments over whether rich countries are mobilizing enough money for the poor countries. They did commit back in 2009, 2010 to mobilize 100 billion by 2020, and that doesn't seem to have been met. But on the positive side, I think that the COP has helped create a focus for many non-party actors on the need to move forward. And I think in many aspects, the private sector is moving more quickly than many governments. And I think that the investor statement that FAIRR has put together is a good example of that, of great leadership by the private sector. That's not to say that the private sector can do this all on its own. And I know that companies want governments to create the right environment, the right policy environment in which we can move forward. And I think that there's still a lot to go on, and maybe we can talk a little bit later about what the UK is doing. I don't know whether, should I briefly cover the UK now, or should we?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, actually, just given that it is London Climate Action Week as well, and we're in the UK. It might be interesting to see if anyone has any reflections on what the UK is doing on this topic of agricultural emissions.
Well, I think the best guide to this is the annual progress report that the Climate Change Committee puts together. Its most recent report was published last week. It looks at progress on adaptation and on mitigation, and it reported on the agricultural sector. and the land use sector. And a couple of things to point out for that. The first is that agriculture is currently responsible for about 10% of the UK's annual emissions. The land use sector has been reassessed and is now a net source of emissions rather than a net sink. Previously it was assumed to be. That's mainly due to a reassessment of the role of peat in emissions. The CCC has pointed out that to reach net zero by 2050, we'll need to see agriculture emissions probably reduced by about 30% by 2030, and that we will need to see by 2035, and that you will need to see that the land use sector becomes a net sink by the 2035. In order to do that, that means things like 9% of current agricultural land being turned over to vegetation. So you'll need to shrink the amount of land being used by agriculture, and we'll need to see shifts in consumption that mean a 20% reduction in dairy and meat production on average by 2030. Now, overall, the CCC said that the government, essentially, the words it used was that underlying progress to meet these ambitions remains short in most of these areas. And so there's clearly a lot that needs to be done on agriculture if it's to be on the path and do its fair share towards achieving that 2050 target. And so it's very important that government and industry and consumers all recognise the importance of action in this area.
Thanks, Bob. That's a really interesting point. I just want to turn to one of the questions from the audience here. We've got quite an interesting question in the chat box about research by WWF and Tesco saying that using insects to feed fish and livestock could cut the use of soy and prevent deforestation. So how would the panel see this kind of technology being adopted using the mechanisms at their disposal to encourage investment? So I don't know whether either Lisa or Eugenie, if you have any thoughts on how those types of technologies to reduce emissions could be implemented.
Yeah, I could comment briefly on that. That's definitely something we are seeing, and it is happening. And I think lots of firms are looking into insects and the like, especially for animal feeds. I think one of the aspects to sort of consider there is what is the actual sort of carbon footprint of those operations as well, because at the end of the day, a factory producing insects can also, in some instances, be quite carbon intense, etc. But it is definitely an interesting development, and I think one that we also see within some of the sort of aquaculture type businesses, etc. So I think that's definitely part of the portfolio of solutions in the future.
Great, thanks, Lisa. I also wanted to ask a question more around the kind of sustainable diets and sustainable dietary guidelines question, which obviously was mentioned in this investor statement that was brought out yesterday. And there has been an emerging policy dialogue in several jurisdictions about the role of a shift to sustainable and healthy diets. What do you as a panel think are the kind of key roadblocks to further discussion on this topic? I don't know whether Eugenie, you have any thoughts about this initially.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting and exciting area. There's so much scope for improvement that the current food system is fairly broken. It's not really fulfilling meeting the goals we would like it to meet. We have a situation where 39% of adults globally are overweight, and 22% of the world's children under 5 are affected by stunted growth due to malnutrition. We have a third of food around the world being wasted, and then there's huge climate change and emissions of greenhouse gases. So the good news is that there is such a great overlap between healthy diets and sustainable diets, and that the Eat Lancet work showed that a diet rich in fruit, vegetables, and legumes, and with comparatively smaller amounts of meat to some Western diets, very good for the planet and for our health. There's this big overlap. There are lots of challenges. One of them is that the world's food manufacturers make their money from selling us highly processed, highly packaged food that's made in various different stages. I saw a picture of a plastic tub of pears in jelly this week that had been picked in Argentina, packaged in China, and sold in South Africa. And what's wrong with just eating a real pear rather than this one thing that's traveled all over the world wrapped in plastic? So the current the sort of target markets for the food companies who are currently in the less developed countries and low-income groups, they're currently going to their local market and buying rice and beans and vegetables. And do we really want them to move to a model where they're eating more cornflakes and Pop-Tarts and red meat if that's not part of their diet at the moment? And can companies be far-sighted enough to realize that trying to sell them more of these sorts of products isn't really good in the long run? There's another issue that the big food companies tend to all have their own internal definition of what's healthy. If you look at PepsiCo or Nestle, they have their own internal systems, and organizations like Access to Nutrition do great work trying to actually compare companies on the healthiness of their product portfolio, and they use international standards. Currently, the Australian standard is the one they use, and so what we'd like to see is companies moving towards one unified standard that is accepted by everybody. So that's one thing we'd like to see. And I think another challenge is something I've come across quite a lot recently, is this assumption that it's impossible to significantly change meat eating habits, current meat eating habits in the Western world, or the inexorable rise of meat eating in lower income countries. And there was a story last week by the government's food czar in the UK, Henry Dimbleby, saying that we would like to see government action on reducing meat consumption in Britain, but is it possible that there might be riots in the streets, like in France with the Gilets jaunes, and that meat eating is such an important part of our culture, you can't really challenge it? And I think actually we need to have greater ambition in this area and make sure that vegetarianism, flexitarianism, and so on are seen as appealing by making it cool and stylish rather than sort of hair shirt movement. And we've been engaging with FAIRR and other investors over the last few years with British supermarkets like Tesco, Sainsbury's, and Morrison, who are, trying to increase the sustainable protein that they sell. And we've seen the great target from Tesco to triple the amount of sustainable protein they sell. And I think there's a great movement, particularly with the younger generations, to adopt these different diets. And I think there's more potential there than some people think there is.
Thanks, Eugenie. That's a really interesting point. Just going back to the questions from the audience here, I've noticed there are a couple of really interesting, quite related questions about the reduction in meat and dairy required to meet climate targets. One audience question here has said, how can more environmentally damaging imports of these types of products be controlled if the production emissions are reduced in one country? And another related question there is related to the UK trade flows. Can the reductions be achieved via trade shifts, such as, say, plant-based milk, etc.? Should those kind of trade flows be welcomed? I don't know if anyone else from the audience has, from the panel, has any thoughts on this trade policy question. How does this intersect with trade? Bob, if you have any thoughts, it looks like you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, I think one of the most important ways in which you can help consumers make decisions is through the price signal. And at the moment, we have a perverse system where often environmentally damaging and unhealthy food is cheaper for the consumer to buy than the alternative. And that's just simply wrong. That's a mispricing, and that's a massive market failure, as Eugenie was talking about. Now, we're going to have a much stronger movement to align price signals more strongly with the things we want to do. We've seen that you get pushback from industries. We've seen attempts to push back on any kind of taxation which reflects the damage caused, for instance, by refined sugar or or alcohol, etc. And we need government to be strong in this area, and we need companies to be responsible and not only work in their what they think are their own short-term interests. Food companies that resist regulation, including introduction of taxes, which are designed for the consumer's benefit, are acting in the same way as the tobacco industry did, in my opinion, in resisting regulation. You should not be resisting regulation that's designed to safeguard the health and well-being of consumers. Now, what that would mean, for instance, in this area is that at the moment, meat is an incredibly ineffective way of generating protein for people to eat. And the price that people currently pay for meat does not reflect its true cost. It's effectively very heavily subsidized, not least because the price does not reflect the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced in it. It also doesn't reflect the damage that poor quality meat or overconsumption of poor quality meat can do to people's health. Once you start taking that into account, you'll end up not just making unhealthy options and unsustainable options more expensive, but it should provide an incentive, and this is absolutely critical, for greater innovation in the food industry on healthier options. And for instance, I can see a situation where you would have lab-grown meats for those people who really enjoy the texture and the taste of real meat. For me, there's no reason why you shouldn't be marketing lab-grown meat, and we're already seeing advances in those areas. That's an example. It's very expensive at the moment, but we know that with new innovation, if companies invest, you can reduce the costs over time and make it more affordable. And that would be an example, I think, where you use a combination of restoring price signals, aligning them more properly with what you want to see in consumer behavior, but also innovation to introduce substitution. You get consumer pushback when you make something so expensive or you'll ban it that people really want to do. And what you want to do is create affordable alternatives. Affordable alternatives are at least as good, if not better, than what is currently on offer. And that's what we really need. You don't want to price people out of being eating all the foodstuffs that they want. You do want the effective price signal, and you want to offer proper alternatives so that people make that shift over time. And that's really what we need, I think, to see in government policy.
Thanks, Bob. That's really helpful. Just going back to the audience questions here as well, there's another related question about the sort of global nature of this problem, and an audience question here about what are the ways that we can bring other stakeholders involved, and how are developed countries thinking about supporting the transition in developing countries. It was already mentioned by Eugenie earlier that this is really a global problem. We see, parts of the world really kind of overnourished, and then people are also undernourished in various regions as well. What do we think as a panel about the kind of global shift underway, and how can we support the transition in developing countries? Does anybody have any thoughts on that from the panel? Lisa?
I could venture. I think it's in some ways in the same way as we say that developing countries have the right to grow. I think we will have to recognize that developing nations and those where income is growing, populations will have to be able to choose what they eat, of course, as we have always been able to, and it is now becoming clear that our choices are having a big impact. But I think the sort of challenge with food and related environmental externalities is that food is very much around the sort of personal liberties and choice, etc. So it is hard to dictate anything, of course, whether it's nationally or internationally. But what I do think there is probably some opportunities around technology transfer as well from developed to developing countries around technologies, perhaps within ingredients that are lower methane emitting, for example, for animal feeds, I think would probably be quite an important one. I don't know how feasible or realistic it is to think that there would be sort of technology transfer in something like that. But I think that needs to be considered, certainly. I think, as we have been saying in our work around the sort of climate area and policy advocacy overall, is that it is important for all countries to consider sector pathways. And I think that's what needs to be highlighted, of course, to developing countries as well. To agriculture and food systems need also to be part of those sort of sector pathways when considering our very necessary climate targets in the long term. But it's a harder sector, for sure.
Thanks, Lisa. Yes, I think that's a really interesting point on technology transfer. And perhaps there may be some lessons there from the energy sector in terms of what types of technologies could be developed. As Bob already mentioned, kind of cutting edge technologies in lab grown meat, for example. Perhaps there's some parallels there to draw in terms of global collaboration on new technologies that could be interesting for policymakers to explore. I just want to take another couple of questions from the audience as well, actually, because I think we've got around 10 more minutes left. In terms of regenerative agriculture, obviously this has been a big topic, and there's a question here from the audience: what is the role of regenerative agriculture? And then another audience question here: what about UK pasture-fed meats? Does anybody want to take that question in terms of what the potential could be and what the impacts could be? I'm happy to share a few initial thoughts myself. Actually, we've been looking at the potential of regenerative agriculture, and obviously there is a potential. I think the land footprint also has to be looked at as well. Based on FAIRR's research, we noticed that some of the regenerative agriculture and pasture-fed meats do require more land, even though they are sort of lower carbon. So I think there's a bit of a complex issue there around the land and climate trade-offs. Don't know if anyone else has any further thoughts on that question.
I think regenerative agriculture has got a huge amount of potential, and it's exciting to see big companies like, I think Nestle's got a target of investing over $1 billion into regenerative agriculture, and they've got a huge supply chain network of farmers that they can help train and really share best practice. So I think that's fantastic. And then on the question about UK pasture-fed meat, I think as Lisa was mentioning before, we have to look at the footprint of all these products in comparison. And yes, I'm sure UK pasture-fed meat is better than imported grain-fed meat. I still think it's much higher impact than getting your protein from vegetarian sources. But yes, local meat and the meat that has been raised in much higher environmental standards is better. But if you look at the carbon footprint of even things like cheese, which I didn't realize, I thought it was red meat, beef and lamb were the worst, and then other meat. But I've seen data that even cheese can be worse than some forms of meat, poultry. That there is no easy solution. Like just saying you can eat British beef, it isn't, sadly, I don't think, as simple as that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's lots of trade-offs to be considered in this sector as well, given the complexity that we see of the food system. There's also a question here about pricing from the audience. So instead of aiming to reduce prices of alternatives, should we also be increasing the prices of the conventional products, as low prices mean someone else is paying the price along the line? And we've already had comments from Bob Ward about the role of subsidies in this as well, which is something FAIRR has worked on as well. We actually have a working group of investors looking at the topic of subsidy reform and calling on the EU to reform the agricultural subsidies in line with climate goals. I don't know if any of the panelists, if you have any views on the role of pricing and how we can actually price in the risks externalities into the market in the food system?
Well, I feel quite strongly personally that some sort of tax, carbon tax on meat, biodiversity tax, environmental tax on meat to incorporate these externalities is the most just way of doing it, because, as Bob mentioned, there are huge environmental costs that are just not incorporated into meat. Then the social justice issues related to that. But I think that, as with all taxes, we don't want them to be regressive, and we can figure out solutions around that, and we can invest the money raised by the taxes in helping the lower income groups or helping the farmers. I'm sure there are ways that clever people can figure out this tax to internalize these externalities into the price of meat. But that is my personal position. I don't think Aviva Investors has fully developed a position on this yet.
I could maybe sort of add there that I think, to me, that seems like a sort of natural or logical way of sort of dealing with this. But every time I have been, for example, in roundtables, when we've been talking about use of antibiotics, for example, in farming to increase yields, etc., I would say that the answer by the sort of farming groups is always about affordability and pricing. So, so you want food to be much more expensive then. And that is it is a very effective sort of message to policymakers. Policymakers do not want to be the ones who are sort of delivering the news of more taxes. That's not a popular way of doing it. So I think that's why it has been so hard to sort of implement in many jurisdictions the sort of tax way. And in some ways, I think potentially looking at other ways of thinking about more cheaper alternatives could be a way around it, because there's clearly a bottleneck around this whole issue of taxes, and it's sort of preventing us from getting anywhere at the moment on the question. So I think affordability is so critical in these conversations with the sort of farmers, farm unions, and policymakers. But I think that's where we, as investors as well, do have a role to sort of talk about our views and that we could be proponents of that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the consumers who are going to be voting with their wallet, so to speak.
Can I just add on that? I mean, I think there's an essential principle here we have to push for. Prices should reflect costs. There is no argument, no reasonable argument to say that something that's expensive, that it is expensive. And we're not just talking about production costs. If your food stuff you're producing makes people more susceptible to disease, that disease is a real cost, and that should be reflected in the price, right? There's no real argument to say, no, we should be allowing things that are unhealthy and environmentally unsustainable should be cheaper for the consumer. That's not a sensible argument. What we're talking about is a proper distribution of costs. And I come back to this fact that a fundamental principle of pricing is that it should be in line with what you want for society. And if you have food that is unsustainable and unhealthy being cheaper than the alternative, that's just wrong. Nobody can sensibly argue for that. So we have to have that restatement. But as I said, it's not enough just to make the unhealthy options more expensive. You're going to have to try and make the healthier, sustainable options cheaper, so that you're getting a shift that isn't making, we don't want poor families having essentially finding it more difficult to have a sustainable diet. You want to make it easier for them. And Eugenie mentioned that if the overall price is more expensive for the sustainable option, well, you can use the revenues in order to cushion it. We can use the benefit system in a way to help address it. And so I'm not convinced. It's not an economically sound argument. It's not a socially sound argument to say, oh, well, there's some kind of higher order right to price foods that are bad for you and bad for the environment more cheaply than the alternative. It's just not a sound argument at all.
Thanks, Bob. So I guess sort of linking this back to policy as well, I think there's a really interesting point here about how public finance is used and how subsidies are used in the pricing of food products. And that links to the question of, you know, what proportion of currently the agricultural subsidies are going to the healthier versus unhealthier kinds of foods. So I think that's a really interesting point there. Just in the interest of time, I think we may only have time for around one more question, actually, given that we're closing quite soon. There's quite an interesting question here from the audience, which links back to your question, Bob, on the role of food industry lobbyists. Given that their behaviour can be comparable to that of the tobacco industry lobbyists, how will policymakers be able to curtail those types of damages? I don't know if Bob, if you or anyone else on the panel has any thoughts on that quite interesting question.
Can I just, I'll say something very briefly. I mean, essentially, the way you deal with lobbying is transparency. And if you may have seen overnight, there's been a story breaking about ExxonMobil and its behavior in lobbying against climate policy, which I don't think anybody was surprised about, but it was a bit shocking. But in my view, if you have food companies lobbying against policies that are designed to improve environmental standards or improve health standards, then they should be outed and they should then have to compete in the court of public opinion. The consumer has a right to know that if they're buying a product, that the company has behaved in what is an unethical way and against the best interests of the consumer.
Thanks, Bob. I think that's a really interesting point. I'd just like to turn to the other panelists as well, if there's any final reflections before we wrap up the session. Lisa, do you have any thoughts on any of the topics so far, or any final reflections?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to slightly sort of comment on the last point, and that's that I fully agree on all those points made about pricing and lobbying as well. But I do think that the area sort of that we discussed in other sectors, for example, the energy sector, of a sort of a just transition is quite key here as well, and I think would sort of help, you know, that a just transition and not sort of ensuring that farmers are not left behind, and which might also sort of increase these the whole polarization in the conversation, you know, farmers against some urban consumers, etc. So I think that's a sort of important aspect to remember also in the food and agriculture sector.
Yeah, and exactly what I wanted to say as well is that I think we can be too short-sighted and just say, are we affecting consumers today by having more expensive food and farmers? Are we threatening them? Actually, what we're trying to do is save the viability and the sustainability and the health of people in the long run. We're trying to make sure those farms are there in 100 years and they're not operating in temperatures of 49 degrees centigrade like we've seen in Vancouver this week. Farms will not be viable in that temperature. And you know, they won't have any consumers if the consumers don't have any money because of climate change, or if they're unhealthy because of their unhealthy diets. We want the world to be sustainable and viable, and that's why I think these policy changes will benefit everybody in the long run. And it's important to keep that long run perspective in mind.
Thanks, Eugenia. I think that's a really important final reflection to be made on this panel, actually. I mean, the link back into the extreme impacts of climate change and how we need to actually defend our food system from those impacts in order to really have a viable agricultural system and viable ecosystem for a livable planet. So I'd just like to really thank everyone for being here today. Actually, it's been a really interesting, engaging discussion, lots of feedback from the audience and lots of really interesting questions on this quite challenging topic moving forward. I also wanted to thank the London Climate Action Week as well for hosting this on their website as a London Climate Action Week event. Been really interesting, and also to remind everyone actually that this final this statement that we brought out yesterday is still open for signatory by investors as well. So this is the Where's the Beef investor statement. Already 5 trillion of investors are supporting the statement that's basically calling on the G20 to disclose effective targets for agriculture as part of their NDC commitments. And we have also had support from an endorsement from Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General. So that statement is still available on our website if there are any investors on the call who would like to sign on, and we'll be leaving that open for signature in the run-up to COP26, where we'll be engaging with other stakeholders and policymakers around this topic. So we look forward to collaborating with you all in future, and it's been a really great discussion. So I'd just like to really thank everybody for coming, and for all our panelists on this really interesting dialogue, and look forward to staying in touch with you all on this topic. Thanks a lot, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.